Welcome back to History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton, your instructor. Now, in this lecture, we're going to discuss a favorite topic of mine. We'll be discussing the religious translation of deities from the East to the West Fertile Crescent. Now, this is an idea that completely changed the Southern Levant. Note that when I say translation, I'm not talking about interpreting text in foreign languages. I'm talking about translating concepts from one culture to another. In this case, those concepts revolve around Baal, or Baal, as it's often pronounced. Now, here we will speak to the origins of Baal, discussing both the ancient Levantine religion and culture and the Mesopotamian religious influence upon the Levant. Readers are told that the study of the history of religion should aim, quote, to reconstruct religion on the basis of its extant remains, belief through texts, cult through material culture, end quote. Now, as noble as that sounds, it doesn't adequately describe the process of discovering an ancient religion. If we try to reconstruct religious belief only through their texts, ignoring how they worship, or if we try to discover the cult only through material culture, ignoring their ritual texts, what we find may be something other than what they believed and practiced. The study of religion needs, when possible, to take both of these approaches into question. We need to study both texts and cultic practices. Of course, the text does create for us a narrative and a history, providing us an advantage of better understanding why certain practices were performed. Now, sometimes, though, the great majority of evidence lies with either texts or material culture. Instead, and although ancient religions can be quite complex, the student can begin with an understanding that religion is the service to and the worship of the divine through the attitudes, beliefs, and practices altogether of the worshiper. Religion is holistic. Now, of course, studying ancient Levantine religion is problematic from the very start. When one thinks of the earliest times in the ancient Levant, one normally thinks of the Canaanites and the various tribes related to them. But the later Canaanites that we know through the biblical text, who were Semites, were likely not the aboriginal inhabitants. From an archaeological perspective, there's a major cultural shift at the beginning of the early Bronze Age from the culture before. From a biblical perspective, Canaan was a son of Ham, not Shem. Now, assuming the biblical text to be accurate, a possible explanation may be that the Semitic Canaanites moved into the land at the beginning of the early Bronze Age, causing that major cultural shift. And then, of course, just retained the name because it was a place name. In fact, this may be a fulfillment of the Genesis 9 curse upon Canaan, where Shem and Japheth were said to be masters of Canaan and his descendants. The eventual outcome of the Hamitic Canaanites is uncertain, but perhaps they were absorbed by the Semites and Japhethites that lived in the region. Now, just a little tidbit concerning the curse of Canaan. A West Semitic legend most likely concerned with the annual summer drought helps us to understand Ham's error. The Achat epic details a father named Daniel. Sounds kind of like Daniel. Daniel's desire to have a son. Listed among his reasons are these two. First, to shut the jaws of his father's abusers, to shut up the mouth of those who were talking bad about his dad, and to hold his father's hand when he's drunk. Now, although Achat is much later than the Noachian event, it nonetheless tells a story of a son violating his cultural duties and telling Japheth and Shem about their father, thus both abusing his father and not caring for him when he's drunk. Okay, back to the lecture here. The basis of Canaanite religion in the early Bronze Age was the worship of the deity El, as per theophoric evidences. Now, this was not a monotheistic religion, but El was the head of the pantheon. In Ugaritic texts, El is the chief god. El is somewhat different than other ancient deities in that he's described as an aged, wise, and kindly creator god. Of note is the fact that El is the creator of all things, the father of the gods and of humanity. While there are other gods, El is the chief and stands out from the other lesser gods, and that he has no nature-centered symbolism. He's not the storm god or the sea god or the god of death or the god of frogs or the god of apple pie or whatever. El is a different kind of god. Now, this is the Canaan that Abraham enters. Note the differences between the biblical attitude toward Canaan before and after Israel's bondage in Egypt. After Egypt, God tells the Israelites to push the Canaanites out of Canaan. But before, the reader of the biblical text finds Abraham's interactions in a more positive light. Abraham makes deals with the Canaanites. That's Genesis 23. He fights alongside Canaanites in Genesis 14. He even worships with Canaanites, Genesis 14:22. Of particular interest to the subject at hand is that passage in Genesis 14:22, after Melchizedek offers a blessing upon Abram by the name of El Most High, it's El Elyon. Abram responds by raising his hand in a vow to Yahweh, El Elyon, or El Most High, creator of heaven and earth, an epithet that is quite similar to later Phoenician descriptions of El. The question of whether or not Abram worshipped El, the Canaanite god, is important to the discussion. From the biblical text, it's obvious that Abram worshipped Yahweh, who is clearly identified. But some scholars equate the El Elyon, or El Most High, with El of the local population. Now, on the converse, other scholars adamantly deny the identity of Yahweh with El. In my opinion, there's no problem with ascribing El to Yahweh. Just because Abram may have worshipped El does not also mean that he worshipped or even believed in the rest of the Canaanite pantheon. El simply appears to be an original Semite god, as per textual evidences. These evidences include the Rosh Shamra text, dating to around 1200 BC, where El is rarely used in the appellative, as well as the theophoric evidences in the execration texts of Egypt, dating to around 1900 BC, where the name El is used repeatedly in place names or the names of kings. Within the biblical text, we have an example of Elohei, a common noun used to define El, a proper noun. Even in East Semitic languages, we find El as a proper noun. For example, El appears in the earliest Old Akkadian text without case ending, as use of the divine name. Now, as already noted, the use of El as a proper noun is not problematic. Whether or not Abram worshipped El, the Canaanite god, is not in question. What is important to note is that El, the Canaanite god, was worshipped in Canaan at that time, and that Abram was aware of that fact, even using the language of El in his own worship. This does not mean that Abram was worshiping foreign gods. It's obvious that he was worshiping Yahweh. In my opinion, El was likely not an early Semitic god, but the earliest Semitic god. In my opinion, El was the god of Shem. Now, this helps to explain the Canaanite dichotomy before and after the Egyptian sojourn. Abram was with relatives, fellow Semites. Abram was called by the God of the Semites. From future biblical texts, it's clear that the purpose of this calling was to bring about a more pure form of worship, culminating in the person and work of Jesus Christ, as seen in the New Testament. The clash with the Canaanites comes only after Egypt, and for a very specific reason. Between approximately 1900 BC and 1825 BC, religion in Canaan went through a major shift. Now, theophoric names in the ancient execration text give evidence of this. In the first set, dating to around 1900 BC, theophoric elements in names are L-centered. So in this case, you have a king by the name of Bob L, or Johnny L, or Tom L. Now, in the second set, theophoric elements and names are no longer L-centered, but rather Hadad-centered, thus showing the earliest attested appearance of Baal Hadad in Canaan. So in only 75 years, the populace of Canaan appears to have shifted allegiance from El to Baal. And this shift had taken place in part due to East Semites migrating to the west. The divine name of Hadad was known in West Semitic as Hada, Hadu, or Hadad. In Akkadian, the name appears as Adad or Adu. In Syro-Palestine, the name is translated as Balu or Baal. This deity, then, had taken theophoric roots in some of the names of the rulers in Canaan by 1825 BC. Now they no longer talk about, King Bob El, but King Bob Baal, or King Henry Baal, whatever the names may be. Now, how long Baalism was in the southern Levant before this date is unknown, but one can at least assume that Baalism had not yet become popular by 1900 BC, as El was still the central theme. By the way, I named my youngest son Nathaniel, Nathaniel. And probably many of you have El theophoric elements in your names as well. Okay, for clarity, in an Ugaritic text where Baal's sister Anat is looking for him, Baal is equated through parallelism with Had or Hadad in the Ugaritic texts. Let me just note real quick, we were just mentioning before I started talking about some of you having L names, we were talking about the theophoric elements in the 1825 BC execration text, including the name Hadad, which now I am showing to you is the same thing as Baal. Okay? Anyway, sorry, forgive me. In the Ugaritic text, which read, Baal in his house, the god Had in the midst of his palace. The lads of Baal make answer, Baal is not in his house, the god Had in the midst of his palace. Baal scoops his hands full, the god Had his fingers full. Like a different Canaanite deity, Kothar, who originates in Egypt, Baal Hadad was considered an outsider deity. A second millennium letter from Mari equates Hadad with Baal. In the letter, the prophet Nur-Sin quotes Hadad as giving a weapon to Zimri-Lem, with which Hadad had used to fight against the ocean. A clear correlation to the Baal myth, where Baal had fought Yam, god of the sea. Yam is the Hebrew word for sea, or ocean. It seems that as Hadad moved farther westward, he was identified according to his perennial ecological attributes. Of course, to say that Hadad is Baal is a step too far. The adaptation and translation of deities from one city to the next always allowed for changes depending on the socioeconomic climate of the new location. Eventually, he came to be known as Baal-Hadad, and then finally as Baal, thus a storm god known well in the biblical text. Important to this present study is the origin of Baal. If not from Canaan, then where? The most likely candidate for the origin of the spread of Baalism to Canaan is Mari, where Baal was called Adu. Adu is attested from Mari continually from the early dynastic period. Having noted that the comparison of storm god versus sea god before, it's interesting to note that one of the theophoric names given to Marduk, who was a storm god who fought Tiamat, who is a primordial water ocean deity. I kind of lost my place. Anyway, one of the theophoric names given to Marduk contains Adu, though this name could have been added later. Adu joins Dagon. Okay, I don't know why that did that. The first one is Adu, the middle one is Dagon, and the last one is Itumir. Let me see if I'm really messing this up. Okay. Okay. Forgive me, let me back up a little bit. Adu is the first one on the left. Dagon is the middle one. Itumir is the one on the right, the local dynastic god. Anyway, Adu joins these other two at the top of the pantheon in Mari. And there's debate as to which deity was the true chief god of Mari. It could have been Itumir, which seems to have a linguistic correlation with, the whole mare aspect. Mari into mare. But textual evidence suggests that Dagon was the chief deity of the region. The earliest firm attestation of Dagon dates back to around 2350 BC. Of note is that although Dagon appears throughout the West, in fact, Ugarit had a temple to Dagon, he does not appear in the extant mythology. Dagon's name does appear, but in relation to another deity, Baal. Baal is called the son of Dagon 11 times in Ugaritic texts. Baal once in the Baal cycle calls El his father, but in that same text he's also called the son of Dagon, again showing his outsider status. This Baal-Hadad, or Adu, likely migrated from Mari near or during the establishment of the Lim dynasty. There's a high degree of continuity between the former Shekanaku dynasty and that of the Amorite period. So it's possible that absorption of deities occurred at that time. Additionally, due to its high trade status, Ugarit likely sought trade early on with the Amorites in Syria, and through them even farther. This trade no doubt brought the national Amorite god to Ugarit. One possible problem with this theory is that a temple of Hadad existed in Aleppo in pre-Sargonic times, contemporaneously with the Mari cult. Of course, Hadad of Aleppo could have also stemmed from Mari. Whatever the case, Hadad did appear to be a Semitic deity to a point. The provenance of Hadad is unclear, but the evidence still stands that Hadad did not enter into the land of Canaan until around 1825 BC. Interestingly, the god Itumir of Mari is possibly an ancient storm god, likely the later manifestation of the more ancient Mer. Itumir is mentioned during the Sargonic period in South Babylonia, but afterward is not mentioned outside of the Mari region. He survived alongside Adu up until the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, when he declined in popularity. And it's possible that this early non-Semitic deity may have been the precursor to what Adu, Hadad, Baal would eventually become. I have no idea why that just popped like that. Okay, now, no pictures. I'm sorry about all that. I want you to think about this for a moment. In the Baal cycle, the storm god Baal overthrows the chief deity El, taking his throne and even castrating him. Although the myth is supposed to be in the distant primordial past, we can see when Baal takes over the Levant as he's firmly rooted in Canaan by 1825 BC. This date is important because Jacob and his family go down into Egypt around 1876 BC. This means that Israel was likely not in Canaan when the religious shift took place. Remember, Abraham got along great with the Semitic Canaanites. So did Isaac and Jacob. What changed between then and the conquest was the infiltration of a foreign deity. Abraham was there to purify the religion of Shem. That religion had become polluted with polytheism. He was there to show the world the one true God. Unfortunately, by the time the Israelites came out of Egypt and entered into Canaan, everything had changed with Baal worship. Now you have cult prostitution. You have this offering children to Molech, all through that Baal worship. All right, thank you so much for listening to me ramble on. Feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.